Welcome to the Creating Wealth Podcast, where Kyle Curtin takes you on an extraordinary journey alongside renowned multifamily real estate sponsors and syndication experts from every corner of the United States. We teach you how to harness the power of passive real estate investing and witness the transformation of your wealth building strategy. Let's create wealth together.
I guess kind of like what's your, like standard operating procedure in a way of figuring out like what the immediate, like urgent items are versus maybe things that you can kind of like space out. Like, how do you kind of like navigate something like that?
So for that, you really need to understand the business plan a little bit, right? So the business plan so I supported a lot of acquisitions and due diligence and disposition due diligence as well. And it sounds funny, disposition due diligence, but I can dive into that as well. But I mean, I supported over $1 billion worth of transactions in the multifamily real estate space. And when you look at a brand new acquisition opportunity, it's hard because during the due diligence phase, a lot of flags will come up. I mean, just like when you buy a single family home, you get the home inspection and the home inspector lists everything, right? Like, oh, there's a crack in the baseboard. And it's like, yeah, that shouldn't kill your deal, but it's something to be aware of, right? So my job was identify everything. And so I would bring a team with me to do the due diligence work. And I would gather all that data and I would look at it all. And it's like, all right, in a vacuum, hey, let's say the worst problem, right? Let's say the property is experiencing active leaks and damage and poor customer satisfaction from a roof, right? That kind of puts that on the high end of, hey, you really need to take care of this. But at the same time, let's say that leak is maybe in a trash room or a back of house utility space. It doesn't necessarily get the same type of attention that you would think it would, but it's a mix of what is your business model? What's your business plan, right? If you're going in and you're going to redevelop, you're going to rebrand a property, which was a lot of what we did. We would go in there and kind of scratch off everything and say, this is going to be part of our brand. So we have to apply our brand to everything. And we had a certain model that we do. So knowing the owner and the operator's ultimate goal with this property, whether it's we're just going to reposition it and get rid of it in 3 years, or this is a long-term hold core property for us, is going to definitely change what I'd recommend, right? So it's like, if it's a short-term hold, then it's what are the loudest, right? What's the squeakiest wheel? That's where you want to put the attention. But if it's a long-term hold for you, then customer satisfaction is actually going to do a lot more in the driving of what projects you tackle first. Because ultimately, if customers aren't satisfied, your loss to lease is going to be incredible. You're going to be like way off market because Yelp has a lot of effect. Google reviews have a lot of effect. So if those are the type of things you're watching, then you have to weigh it. You have to weigh it in, right? So it's hard to say that there's a perfect formula without knowing an owner and operator's business plan on what their position is on this property, and whether it's a quick turn it and get it capitalized again, or we're going to hang on to this for forever. We're going to look at it very differently and put the money up front into the projects that have the best bang for the buck.
Gotcha. I think it makes a lot of sense, man. And I really like that take on it. Even like just kind of like taking everything into account and kind of figuring out what the most effective and applicable use of, like the reserve capital or whatever it is, in comparison to like what the plan is, like the length, like the forecasted length of the hold period, just what the plan is overall. I really like that, man. It makes a lot of sense. Even thinking about it on the complete opposite end of the spectrum of like, if you just buy like a 2-family or a 3-family or something, and it's like, all right, like I'm probably going to hold it for like, 20 years or, 10 years, whatever it is. And like how you navigate that on a drastically smaller lens, You know, and comparing that to like, you know, a humongous like skyscraper like beast, you know what I mean? It's cool. It's
when you're dealing with those big type of projects too, there are things that you might not necessarily fully understand. You know what I mean? You get into a property that is a really big property, and what might not be like in your face all the time, right? It could be something that's just a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
You know, I can't tell you how many times we've walked into these beautiful big properties and you realize that there are things in the background happening, but hey, as long as they're still performing, we're fine. And then you find out your domestic tank just went, and that domestic tank supports 100 units. You know what I mean? Like, that's not good. When your domestic supply gets impacted by like that, it's not a quick fix. You know what I mean? And it has such long-term impact on your customer. So you have to be aware of, if like you have to forecast out a little bit of, hey, if we don't do this project, what's the worst that could happen? Right. And then, you know, weigh that against all the other things. So it's a really extreme example of like a cost benefit analysis, but you have to do it quickly in your head because you don't have 6 months to kind of wrap your head around all the different assessments and all the different things you could do. But it's similar in a way to doing like reserve study inspections for condominiums, right? So I've done a lot of reserve studies where these condominiums might not be 300 units, but they still have a lot to deal with because there's a lot of common area components, whether it's pavement, roofing, shared siding, things like that, or if it's shared utility systems that you have to tackle. You have to understand what the big picture is and what happens if something goes down, but also lay out all the options, because what a lot of people don't really take into account is, if we don't do the capital project today, we can just do it in 3-5 years. But it's like, yeah, but are you actually tracking enough on the cash flow side and putting enough away in reserves to be able to tackle that? In most cases, that might not be the situation. So if you're not cash flowing enough, and if you don't put away enough reserves, number one, your investors are going to get hurt by that, right? Because if you're either over banking in your reserves, your investors aren't getting the payout that maybe they want. Or if you're not banking anything in reserves, the last thing you want to do is put a capital call into your investors and say, hey, you know how when we bought this property, there was $3 million worth of initial CapEx we were going to do, but we only took off $2 million? Well, that other $1 million we didn't do on day one, we thought we'd be able to make it up in cash flow over the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to come up $1 million short. Like, you know, what do you do? Ouch. At that point, you have to recapitalize it, right? So whether you refinance it, you sell it, you do something like that, and you make it the next buyer's problem. And then the $1 million worth of CapEx that you didn't do turns into $1.5 million or $2 million on somebody else's spreadsheet. When they underwrite it, they're going to underwrite it much higher than you underwrote it. So you have to stay in tune with any projects that you don't decide to do. You have to watch those projects, because if it's a commodity that is volatile, right? So like roofing products, petroleum-based products, things like that, your roof today might cost you $1 million. But if you decide, you know what, I'm not going to do it, and then the petroleum commodity like skyrockets, well, that $1 million roof is now going to cost you $2 million in a year. You know what I mean? That's not unheard of, especially now with what everybody's seen with COVID, with the material prices skyrocketing. I mean, I was helping a buddy price up a project the other day. Again, this is kind of where it's not big multifamily stuff. It's a friend of mine that was doing a project, and he's like, hey, help me budget this. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I know I was paying around like 70 cents a square foot a couple of years ago for this, but I haven't really done that work in a while. Let me just double check it on you, but you might want to carry a little bit more, like maybe carry $1. And when I actually ran the numbers and I pulled up all this info, I'm like, it's $1.30. And he's like, how long ago was the 70? And I'm like, yeah, that was maybe 3 years ago. And it's like, in 3 years, material price on this one project doubled. And it's like, and you can't make that up. You know what I mean? Like, you can't necessarily properly prepare for that unless you're watching these things on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's wild, man. And it's incredibly interesting to me, like how much, like how that like affects like everybody throughout the entire like ecosystem, like in the entire environment, right? Of like, you know, not having somebody like on your team, you know, that has like particular knowledge, especially, you know, like as deep as the knowledge of yours, you know, and stuff like that, to be able to see some of those things coming down the pipeline, like, you know, pretty far away, you know what I mean? And how that can impact, exactly like you said, like, oh, you know, like now this thing's an extra, you know, like 50 cents a square foot, and you need like, you know, a ton of square feet or whatever it is. Now there's like a huge unexpected expense. Well, that's going to keep going like up the funnel and, you know, affect like returns. Hopefully there's not a capital call there. If there is a capital call, now your investors get pissed, your investors don't come back. Like it's funny, like it's not funny, but like it's interesting how it all like spider webs like from the bottom, you know what I mean, of like having just an incredibly deep understanding of the actual physical construction aspect and the structure and the plan that surrounds that, and just how that affects everybody as a whole, down to the passive investors on the other side of that. You know, it's friggin' incredible, man.
That's a wrap for today's episode. We want to thank you for being a valued listener of the Creating Wealth Podcast. Make sure to visit www.creatingwealth.com to connect with us. Dive into our ever-expanding library of informative blogs. Get access to our private investor portal and explore a wide range of additional valuable resources. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to create wealth together.